Welcome to another Nonsense Wars production. Today we look at another commissioned build. 3 units of an E5 series Shinkansen, a contemporary high-speed train currently operated by JR East and potentially to be exported to India. This was a very different build aesthetically and mechanically, and a very unusual one for me because the prototype is a funny color and not American, though I have seen these in person in Japan before. A typical E5 train set has 10 cars, a T1C and a TSC streamlined cab car, 4 M2 coaches, 2 M1 cars with pantographs, and an M1K and an M1S coach. This build includes a T1, an M2, and an M1, which is sufficient to represent an entire train if the M1K and M1S coaches are replaced with M2 coaches or even M1 cars without the pantographs. Let us take a look at the unique, then the shared features of all the cars. The cab cars have the most salient feature of the entire E5 train set, the very long, aggressively streamlined nose. This took a long time to model, and it felt more like modeling a boat hull rather than a train body. Some of the techniques I used in my battleship builds definitely found their way here. Though the nose takes up more than half the car, the back of the T1 also has a removable roof and a roughly scale interior. While the M2 coach has perfectly straight sides and a perfectly straight roof, having the doors at the ends of the body causes its own problem. I originally wanted to indent all the doors on all the cars by 1 LU, but I could not do it here because the last 1 LU of a 1 stud thick door would appear on the indented end faces. I could not find a way to work around this, so I had to make all the doors flush. The M2 also has an entirely removable roof and a roughly scale interior. Perhaps fittingly, the M1 car with the pantograph also houses the motors and electronics. For once, I felt that train motors synergized well with the parameters of the build. The client wanted a high top speed, a completed train set would have a fixed load, and everything would only ride on bearing axles and on R104 curves. Any sort of geared drivetrain probably would have run slower and have been very hard to fit anyway. At this point, I also want to mention the color scheme. Whereas the C&O M1 had a couple stripes of dark blue, the E5 uses a ton of teal. I did try to limit the types of teal parts again, but oftentimes I didn't have much of a choice. For example, I use a lot of 1x8 plates and no 1x4 plates because on average, 1x4 plates cost more than 2 times as much as 1x8 plates. On the flip side, other parts like 2x4 tiles cost surprisingly little. Anyway, all of these very long cars have inward tapering skirts covering all the wheels. Keeping this feature intact makes for a very unusual design trade-off. The trucks don't need any greebles whatsoever, but they also have to fit under the skirt. Before starting any of the actual design, I tested if this was all possible. I knew it would never work on our 40, but I didn't know if it could even work on R104. Luckily, the bogies barely fit even before using the slightly thinner bearing axle wheel sets. Now, I could have attached parts of the skirt to the trucks themselves, but this would potentially leave large gaps in the bodywork, and it might have increased the chance of derailment on bumpy tracks. Either way, that would not fix the next issue. The skirts need support at the ends of the cars, and these supports leave a 4-wide gap for any sort of tongue on which to mount the usual magnetic coupler. Unfortunately, a 2-wide tongue with a fish plate doesn't allow the bogies to pivot enough, so I needed to use something narrower. After much finagling, I reluctantly settled on coupling with pins instead of magnets, and even these 1-wide drawbars come close to hitting the ends of the skirts, especially in S-bends, since the ends of the cars go far out of line due to their long length and bogie placement. Though we call R104 curves wide radius, this scales to a prototypical radius of just 130 feet. Even the oldest Shinkansen lines have a minimum curve radius of more than 8,000 feet. Either way, this coupling mechanism works fine from a model perspective, since the E5 is a fixed train set, but it doesn't work well from an operational perspective, as it's difficult to join the cars in situ. At least for the power car, I've had to connect things offline and roll it onto the track, which might be more challenging with a full consist. To complicate things further, I had to use a decent amount of parts and sacrifice a bit of structural integrity to achieve the gentle slope of the roofs. These can collapse if handled too aggressively or even fall out, but adding more studs to the mounting makes the roof more prone to breaking when removing it. Furthermore, the construction of the roof forces me to bury the receiver inside the power car. Infrared signals from real power functions will have to travel through the windows. It will definitely work, just not necessarily well, especially when going fast. I would actually recommend using Powered Up or something third-party like Not Power Functions, and that might be mandatory in a full consist with 2 power cars. As far as the actual performance goes, it runs fast, as expected. Even though the train motors don't generate as much power as L motors, the lack of gearing really lets them fly with the right workload, like this one. I explicitly tested that one power car could easily move 4 more cars, such that 2 power cars could easily move a full 10-car consist. But the 1,000-gram car will actually stall the train motors, so I couldn't get an accurate pull rating. Ultimately, without having a whole train set, it's a little difficult to gauge the practicality of operation, but it definitely can be done, and I'd be curious to see it. Finally, for other commission inquiries, check out the info in the video description, but do realize that these builds take a long time and they will be expensive. On that note, this is the end of the video. Please consider subscribing if you like what we do, and have a nice day.